Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden and welcome to The Other Side of History. Now, in our last talk from this series on the history of the Reformation, we talked on the reformer Martin Luther. Now, in this talk, I would like to give you the history of Martin Luther's wife, and her name was Katharina von Bora. Now, Katharina, she was one of the great women from history, and yet she was not without her trials. At the age of 3, she was given to a nunnery. Her mother had died, and her father remarried. So Katharina was put into a convent school for well-off families. Now, her father at this time was a wealthy nobleman, but later he lost his wealth. Now, in 1515, Katharina, she took her vows to become a nun. Now, one fortunate thing was that Katharina's aunt, and her name was Magdalene, she was in the same convent as her, and they seemed to be quite close. So Magdalene had received some of Luther's writings and eagerly imbibed in the Reformed doctrines. Now, gradually, and also secretly, she drew as many as 8 other nuns to her way of thinking. And, of course, Katharina, she was one of these 8 nuns. So the nuns were made to do an endless amount of embroidery. They also distilled herbs. And it was during these times that they found the opportunity to whisper with each other, and they kept each other alert to every bit of ecclesiastical news that came from the outside world. The more that Katharina heard of the teachings of Martin Luther and how he drew the minds away from the empty traditions and the rituals of the church to the Word of God, she began to believe in the principles that Luther taught. In April of 1523, Katharina, along with 11 other nuns, they decided they wanted to leave the cloister. So Martin Luther, he was informed of this, and he encouraged a merchant friend to help the nuns escape. So the merchants, they often delivered saltwater fish to the convent, and one evening this merchant, he bundled up 12 nuns into his wagon in empty fish barrels. Several of the nuns returned to their families. Luther, he helped to find homes and husbands and positions for the rest. Now, within 2 years after the nuns' escape, all of the nuns had been provided for. That is, except one, Katharina. Now, for a while, Katharina, at the beginning, she had lived in an artist's home, and she learned the art of housekeeping. We know of at least 2 suitors who had courted Katharina. In 1524, so right after she had escaped there, she was courted by a student at the Wittenberg University. But his parents, they opposed the match. He was of the wealthy class, and although Katharina's father, remember, had been wealthy, her father had lost his wealth, and Katharina, she ended up with no wealth or family support. So anyhow, but the 2 of these were Katharina and this suitor of hers. They were in love, and they planned to marry. But in the end, the family of Katharina's courter there had their way, and then the romance was called off. So the family found her ex-courter a wealthy, pretty girl, and someone more suitable to their taste. Also the same year, Katharina, she was courted by a pastor, but she refused him. Katharina found that her affections actually were for the doctor, Martin Luther. Katharina was said to have been a physically beautiful woman, and historians tell us that she had a natural dignity about her, which Luther actually mistook as pride until he came to know her better. Katharina's character was of an elevated nature, but Martin Luther, he hesitated to marry. For one, he was much older than Katharina. "Don't you know," he said once, "that I am old enough to be your father?" "Yes," she said, smiling sweetly. Finally, on the 13th of June of 1525, Martin Luther, he proposed to Katharina, and they became engaged. And then on the 25th of June of that same year, they were married in the Black Cloister in Wittenberg. So Martin, he was 41 years old, and Katharina, she was 26 years old. Luther had excited the anger of certain noblemen who were angry at him because their sisters had been received back to the families there, and they were not going to get their full inheritance because these sisters were back home, the ones that escaped there from the convent. So anyhow, these noblemen, they were very angry with Luther, and they had plotted to ambush him, and they had every intention to kill him on the way to his wedding. So we can see that the liberation of nuns, it was actually dangerous business. Luther had been given the building of the Augustinian monastery that was there at Wittenberg by the elector. And into this monastery, Katharina moved after her marriage in 1525. So Katharina, she set up housekeeping. She cleaned up that monastery, and she brought some order to Luther's daily life. Now, Luther, he wrote to a friend, "There's a lot to get used to in the first year of marriage. One wakes up in the morning and finds a pair of pigtails on the pillow that was not there before." So after a year of marriage, Luther, he again wrote to a friend. And he says, "My Katie," that's what Martin Luther called his wife, was Katie for short, her nickname. He says, "My Katie is in all things so obliging and pleasing to me that I would not exchange my poverty for the riches of a king." Luther, this former celibate monk, now he exalted marriage, and he exclaimed, "There is no bond on earth so sweet and any separation so bitter as that which occurs in a good marriage." So Martin Luther, he said, "Let the wife make the husband glad to come home, and let him make her sorry to see him leave." Letters in those days did not express real affection, even if it was to a spouse. However, Luther, he used words of endearment when he spoke affectionately of "my dearest Katie." He sometimes would sign his letters as "your servant." And Katharina, in turn, she would call him her lord. Katharina proved herself an excellent housewife, yet their purse was limited, and she had to be very frugal while at the same time being very hospitable. Martin Luther, he liked to keep an open table for friends and for students, but she found that he was charitable to excess, and it became her work to control some of this. Her admiration for him as a reformer was heightened as she saw his immense program of writing, lecturing, and preaching. During his early hours there, he had his prayer and his study, and she took care to leave him undisturbed. Martin called her the morning star of Wittenberg because she rose at 4 a.m. to care for her many responsibilities. She took care of the vegetable garden, the orchard, the fish pond, and the barnyard animals, Often there were as many as 30 students, guests, or boarders that were staying there in the monastery, all of whom came under Katie's care. Luther was often ill, and Katharina was able to minister to him in his illness because of her great medical care and skill. So Katharina's life was not only occupied, however, with everyday concerns. Martin Luther, he encouraged his wife, Katie, in the study of the Bible and suggested particular passages that she could memorize. Now, Martin Luther was not threatened with his wife knowing and expounding upon the Holy Scriptures. Katharina would often sit in the meetings which Martin Luther had with other reformers there in their home. Katharina was so active in expounding about her understanding on things that some of the other reformers told Martin Luther to keep his wife quiet. So we have no record that Martin ever said anything to her. Martin Luther understood the principle that he often spoke about and he wrote about, the priesthood of all believers. And this is the concept where everyone is equal under God. Katharina was both a strong and a capable woman. She seemed to know just how and when she needed to do something. Now, Martin Luther, at times, he would become very depressed. After all, how would we like it if we had to live with a death sentence over our head and also have to endure all of the lies and the scandals that were constantly being heaped upon him? Now, one day, Katharina, she got up and she dressed herself, all in black. She even put a black veil over her face. Every day she did this until it started to drive Martin Luther nuts. "Why are you always dressing in black?" he finally asked. "Well," she said, "because God is dead." "God is not dead," said Martin Luther. "Then why are you acting as though he is?" she asked. Another time, when Martin Luther got into a slump, he locked himself into his study and he would not come out. The doors to his study, they were two huge wooden doors. Remember, this was like a monastery. This had with really tall walls, and the doors, I guess, were just gigantic to the study. So anyhow, after a time went by, Katharina, she actually had the doors taken down. Now, we have no indication from history that Martin Luther was threatened by these actions of his wife. After all, Katharina was right. There was no benefit with Martin Luther acting as he was, getting into such a slump with his depression that would come on him. We are told that Martin Luther loved and respected his wife, Katharina, in a way that was rarely seen in those days. Then Martin Luther's father died, and Katharina, she knew that Martin would be overwhelmed with grief. So, to try to comfort him, she had a portrait painted, and this was of their third child, Magdalene, and she was then 1 year old, and she had this painting sent to him. They had named the girl after Katharina's aunt, Magdalene. Now, Martin Luther, he loved the painting, and he placed it on the wall over against the dining table. In 1540, Martin Luther, he bought a small estate at Zollsdorf, and he gave it to Katharina. The elector offered a supply of timber, actually, that she could have just a free supply of timber for building. Now, this little farm became of great interest to Katharina, who made it thrive for the benefit of the household. She loved to have Martin Luther and the children stay there whenever possible. and Luther shared her childlike joy in the products of her little farm. "My Lord Katie," he wrote once to a friend, "has just set out for her new kingdom, and will take with her a load of timber and attend to some other matters. Katie is living bodily at Wittenberg, but in spirit at Zollsdorf." The Luthers, they had 6 children and also raised 4 orphan children. Their family actually became a model for German families for several centuries. Martin Luther, he viewed marriage as a school for character. Family life helped in the training of Christian virtues, of fortitude, patience, charity, and humility. Home was a haven of rest for Martin Luther, but its joys were overshadowed by death. Their favorite daughter, Magdalene, she died at the age of 14. Their first little girl had died in infancy, but when Magdalene became suddenly ill, they didn't believe that it would be fatal. However, it was. The night before her death, Katharina dreamed that 2 beautiful youths that were gaily attired, or elegantly attired, asked her daughter in marriage. She told this dream to Luther and Melanchthon, who had come to visit them. Now, Melanchthon was deeply moved and said that he thought that this is what the dream meant. He said, "The 2 youths, they are angels, who are come to lead the maiden to the true wedlock of the celestial kingdom." So, we're told that these words were said to comfort Katharina. And Martin Luther, he also tried to comfort Katharina, and he said, "Your dear Magdalene will rise again, and shine like a star, yea, as the sun. I am joyful in spirit, though sorrowful in the flesh. My dear Katharina, we should not lament as though we have no hope. We have dismissed a saint, yea, a living saint, for heaven." In 1546, Katharina, she had more sorrow. Her beloved Martin Luther died. Katharina, she lived 6 more years, but then she also died of pneumonia while trying to escape the bubonic plague. However, she lived to see her children achieve positions of influence. The life of Katharina is an inspiration for all wives and mothers. She was a good and a faithful woman, and her memory has not been forgotten. If you go to Germany, you can even see today at Wittenberg a statue which stands as a tribute to this great woman in history. I hope that you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I would just like to encourage you to click on that like and subscribe button. And I want to thank you for listening, and God's blessings to each one of you.